I'm Steve Rice. I'm the general manager of the AppConfig team. And we'll tell you a little bit about AppConfig, but it's essentially the feature flagging solution at Amazon. So great. Okay, so I'm going to dive in here. First, I'm going to tell a little story that some of you all may know about. So taking you back to February 28th in 2017. Not sure if you were using AWS back then, but there was normal process going on, normal updates. There was an update to S3. And if you know about AWS, you probably know about S3. You're probably using S3. S3 is a very scaled storage solution and used across the internet and by many, many customers. Well, there was an outage that happened that day. It took out all of US East 1, took out a ton of customers, and it was a really, really big deal. And in fact, it's such a sort of backbone of AWS and some of our customers' workloads that it took out hundreds and hundreds of customers. It was not a good day. Again, wondering if you all remember that. AWS posted something that was basically a walkthrough about what happened. And the line I want to call out here is, unfortunately, one of the inputs to the command was entered incorrectly. They were just making some configuration changes, some dynamic configuration changes, and there were some changes there that caused the outage. And it took a bit to figure out what was going on, and it took a couple hours to fix it. And in fact, our health dashboard was out during the time because it relied on S3. So again, we've made changes since then. But if you know about AWS, we take all these outages very, very seriously, and we do a very deep dive through a process called correction of errors. And in that, we really found that there were kind of three things that went wrong. One was that there was a typo in the input in the configuration. And that's the obvious one. Okay. The second thing is that the change to the configuration was pushed out everywhere all at once. And hey, this is just a configuration change. We're just going to push it out. And I mean everywhere all at once in terms of across US East, across all the AZs. The third thing was that there wasn't anything that automatically rolled back the change once they realized alarms were going off and things were wrong, and it took some time to diagnose. So those three things I want you to remember. We're going to sort of talk about those three themes throughout the presentation. But again, input not validated, configuration change was pushed out everywhere all at once, and then the rollback wasn't automatic. So our agenda, with that story done, not a happy story, but a very helpful story. But with that done, we're going to dive into our agenda here. I'm going to spend just a quick bit talking about the benefits of feature flagging. I think I was looking at the list here. I actually was saying as host, I can see some names. You all just see attendee number X. But I recognize there are some people that I know are using feature flags today, and there are some names I don't recognize. So I just want to set the table about what feature flags are and their benefits. We're going to dive into 4 use cases that we use at Amazon extensively. We're going to also talk about 4 different anti-patterns that we've learned from and call those out. We have a wrap-up slide, and then we'll do questions at the end. In terms of questions, I said this before, but I'd like you all to use the chat. You can post a question in there. I think there's something in WebEx called Q&A. Let's not use that. Let's just use the chat, and we'll try to get to all the questions. If you post a question in chat in the middle, we might have one of the hosts here be able to answer it in chat as well. But okay, great. So setting the table here, what are feature flags? Essentially, feature flags are switches and dials you see on the picture here that allow you to change the configuration of software, which allows you to change the behavior of the software on production without pushing any code changes. So you have your code, it's running on production, it's polling at a regular interval saying, let me read the configuration, let me read the configuration. And if the configuration changes, you might have some code that says, well, if this is on, then do this. If this is off, then do the other thing. And this ability of separating sort of the code from configuration and the ability to tweak software on production without a code push is transformative. And again, looking at the list, I think some of you are doing this already, and those that aren't, I highly, highly recommend that you start looking at feature flags as a way to address things quickly. So some of the benefits of feature flagging, what we hear from customers is that it's allowed them to move much faster. One customer told us that they increased their release velocity by 300%. So they were releasing, once every 2 weeks. They started implementing feature flags, and they were able to release things very, very quickly. The reason why is they don't have these long-lived code branches. They can just release things quickly onto production, turn them on with a feature flag, turn them off if they need to. So it allows you to move fast. The second thing that we hear from customers is it allows us to move safely. I can push something out. I can push it out gradually, not everywhere all at once. I can push it out gradually and sort of test it out in a small setting and know that it's working correctly. And then I can roll it out slowly. So it allows you to move more quickly. More safely. But the second thing is it allows you to address problems very, very quickly. Again, if there's some problem that's caused by whatever it is in your code, you will have a kill switch so you can just turn that off without pushing a whole new release of the code and address your emergent problem on production very, very quickly and safely. The other thing I'm going to say is, there are some safety guardrails that we're going to talk about. This picture has safety guardrails if you look at your screen right now. These safety guardrails are really, really important. Feature flags are super powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. I think that's a Spider-Man quote. And so you need to make sure you have some of these safety guardrails in place when you're using feature flags. A couple terms that we're going to use this morning just to sort of differentiate what they are. So there's a release flag. That's typically what people think about when they hear the term feature flag. Oh, I want to be able to release a new capability or a new feature, and I'm going to release that. And that's really a short-term flag. So we'll call that a release flag. We have operational flags. These are things that are dials and switches that live in your code that allow you to do some tuning on production without pushing out code changes. So these are things like throttling limits or allow lists or that kind of thing. There's a superset of all this called dynamic configuration, basically configuration data that's read dynamically, not necessarily at initialization time, but as your application is running, as I was describing before. So dynamic configuration is a sort of a catch-all term. AppConfig, which we'll talk about a little bit, covers all of these types of flags. So I told you that the purpose of our talk is to give you best practices about how we use feature flags at Amazon. I'll say, number one, we use them at scale. They're basically required for all of our products, internal and external tools. So every single new feature or capability, it needs to have a feature flag in front of it when it gets released. We aren't allowed to push out code that is just introducing a brand new feature. You need to have that switch in front of it, and that kill switch really, because then you can turn it off quickly if something goes wrong. We're also required through a process we have to have these operational flags. We can't release software if there's not a way to have an allow list that only allows certain users, or a block list that only allows certain users to access the code. So we have to have these operational flags. It's part of not just our culture, but it's part of a requirement that we have. And then we also have a tool internal. I love the name. It's called Dogma. And there's a tool that enforces the proper use of these feature flags. It must have some of these safety guardrails. Now, again, we'll talk about what they are and whether or not it makes sense for your organization. But as your organization grows, I would say that these safety guardrails are absolutely critical. And then this is a culture thing that sometimes some people don't quite get right away. Any change to production has risk. Even if it's just a configuration change and I'm just turning on a new feature, there's risk associated with it. And you really need to have that mindset to say there's risk. I want to release this in a safe way rather than just, my marketing team wants me to turn this on for everybody. I'm just going to push it out. It's no big deal. So that mindset permeates AWS and Amazon. So very quickly, talk about AppConfig. We have a couple demos today that are going to show you that product. AppConfig is the feature flagging product of choice inside of AWS and Amazon. We provide feature flag for Lambda and EC2 and Bedrock if you're using that. Also devices and mobile devices with Alexa. And Amazon.com uses AppConfig. So part of the reason I talk about this is we've learned a lot with these quote unquote internal customers of ours. And we've implemented some of those mistakes and best practices as features inside of AppConfig. A couple of our differentiators. There are a lot of great feature flagging solutions out there. People ask us what are some different things about AppConfig. Number one is our native integrations with other AWS services. That sort of goes without saying. We have sort of easy to use ways of consuming feature flags inside of all the computes, EKS, ECS, EC2, on-prem, and Lambda. We have a lot of different security options that are important, as you may know. Like, security is the #1 feature of AWS. Availability is the #2 feature, and then #3 is what the service does. So we have features like IAM, we have PrivateLink, customer managed keys. Those are all things that are included with AppConfig. I talked about the safety guardrails, and we'll demo some of them, but these validators of configuration, if you remember that S3 outage, there was a typo. We now have the ability to validate, maybe it's proper JSON, maybe it's some range in JSON schema. So we have the ability to validate this. We're big fans of gradual deployments. That really limits your blast radius, so deploying things out slowly. We do have the ability to automatically roll back a change if an alarm goes off during the deployment of that configuration data. And then we have an agent that we vend just to make it easier to consume configuration data, as well as it builds some best practices in there about caching. Okay, and then also I'll just call out, we have a pay-as-you-go pricing model. It's somewhat unique. Okay, top 4 feature flag use cases. I am going to hand over to Gunnar for his discussion.
Steve. So if you are an AWS user today, which I think most of you are, you've probably heard about AWS reInvent. So AWS reInvent is our big yearly conference happening in Las Vegas. And one of the things reInvent is most known for, it is that during reInvent and in the lead up to reInvent, we do release a lot of new features and services. So all throughout the week, in the keynotes from Adam and Swami and Werner and so on, we release a bunch of new features and services. But every time we do, it doesn't mean that we are releasing code into production, because that's happened before. Instead, we're using feature flags. So the #1 use case, or the first use case perhaps, for feature flags is releasing software. So why we're doing this then? Well, when we are releasing a new feature or a capability, we want to do it safely, like Steve talked about before. So we don't want to have a negative impact on the customer or the customer experience when you're using that new service or feature. So we are doing it by having these on-off switches. So we can turn the feature on or off with the help of that toggle. So instead of releasing code into production when it's time, when Werner announces that new feature, for instance, instead the code is already in production. It's just that you, as a user or a customer, you don't see the feature until we toggle that switch. So we can control it and thereby decoupling our releases from the actual code updates. So what we say about this as well is that every feature must have a feature flag. So when we are releasing a new feature, it should be hidden behind the feature flag. So we are starting everything off in the off mode. So when we have deployed into production, the feature is hidden for users. So we are constantly flowing new code into production, but users can't see it until we toggle that switch. And when the time is right, that could be during an announcement in a keynote, we are then starting to roll that feature out to users. And we usually do it gradually, percentage-wise, and then adding more and more users so you can get access to that new feature or service. And everything is constantly monitored. So when we're rolling it out, we make sure that things are working as expected. So if something would happen, we're able to then automatically roll back or manually roll back if we please. And then after a while, we do a cleanup. So we remove that flag. It doesn't have to be there in production anymore after that release has gone out to customers, normally 2 weeks after release. So When Steve, Dylan, Ben, and I aren't doing webinars about AppConfig, we are trying to rent out houses. So this is our side project, kind of. Now, jokes aside, this is a sample website that we're using. It is part of the AWS AppConfig workshop, and we're going to use that to show an example of how this can work. So we're going to run through a quick demo showing how we can use feature flags to be able to enable a new feature. And based on this website, our design team has decided that we want to showcase the houses or the rental places better by introducing a carousel, so we can show multiple pictures for each rental. So let's get to it. So this is the website right now. You can see one picture available per rental, and that's it, basically. And we can then check availability, and we can favorite our rentals. So now we want to roll out this new feature. So I've created an application in AppConfig, and here I now want to create a configuration. And I can then either do it like freeform configuration, or as in this case, a feature flag. So I'm creating a new one. We're calling it card feature flag. And then we are creating that. And now with that one created, we can start adding our flags. So let's create the first flag, giving that a name, in this case, show carousel. And I'm going to tag this as a short-term flag, meaning that it will be flagged for us so we can see that this is a flag we will then remove out of production after, say, 2 weeks, for instance. So checking this is a short-term flag, I could optionally add a date as well. And then I can add attributes if I want to. In this case, we are going to continue without any attributes. So now we can save a new version. That means we can then start deploying that out. So I'm saving my new version. To just show what it looks like, I'm also going to add a second flag, so we can see that as well. In this case, this flag will instead help us with pagination. It will be able to then control the number of cards shown on the page. And this one is not a short-term flag, and I'm also going to add attributes to it. So I'm adding a key first. We're calling it number, which is of the type number. I'm adding my value, the number of cards shown, 8 in this case. And then I can set constraints as well. So minimum 5, maximum 12. And let's add that flag. There we go. And both of these flags are off right now. So we can then enable, put it to on for pagination, for instance. And let's save that as a new version as well. And this is how I'm implementing it. So this is my Lambda function, who's basically giving us the code needed. So I'm making a call to AWS AppConfig and fetching this configuration data. And then I'm using that data in my code. So in this case, I am checking if the pagination flag is enabled. If it is, then I should use the number that we defined in the attributes. And then for the other one, show carousel, I'm also checking if that is enabled. If it is enabled, I'm returning the code that is showing the carousel. Else, that means if it's off, I'm showing or returning the code that doesn't show the carousel. So let's then make sure that we enable the carousel as well, put it into on. We're saving a new version. This is version 3. And now we can then start deploying this. So we're starting a deployment in AppConfig, meaning that we will roll this out to production using version 3. I have a deployment strategy that's going to deploy it quickly just for demo purposes. And now it is starting to deploy, meaning that it is rolling this out. With my strategy, it's just over 1 minute, but it means that over 1 minute, more and more users will start seeing this new feature. So if we go back to the web page and reload it, see, let's reload again. And there we can see that we now have the carousel in place. So we've rolled out this new feature for users so they can start using it. And what would happen now is we continue to monitor, make sure that it works as intended. If we want to, we could do a rollback, or we could even attach monitoring to it and do automatic rollback as needed for this type of feature. So that's a quick example of how we can use flags to release software out to users.
Great. Thank you, Gunnar. I'm going to talk about a second use case that we use extensively inside of Amazon. It's using operational flags, but feature flags for security, and logging verbosity is an interesting use case. So we do use flags out there to be able to, as I mentioned before, put together allow lists or block lists. If there's a bad actor and we want to block a certain account ID, beyond just like IP address blocking, that's done through a dynamic list, through dynamic configuration. And so every service out there has this. And again, instead of pushing out new code that contains a list of IDs and letting that flow through our CI/CD pipeline, you can just adjust the configuration and get that out there very, very quickly. So that's a common use case. The other one that I talked about, the logging verbosity. So there may be a suspected security incident going on, and you might want to increase your logging levels during that incident temporarily. Obviously, you don't want to be in debug mode the whole time, but if something is going wrong or something seems a little strange, you might want to have more verbose logging. And so that's a common use case as well. So I have a demo there about how to set your debug level, sorry, your logging level from info to debug. Let me jump into this here. So again, this is the AppConfig console. We have a set of flags called logging verbosity flags. Now I have one here that says log level, and in there you can see it's set to info. Okay, so currently it's set to info, and this is the sort of normal state of our logging level. I'm going to switch over here just to a simple Lambda, and this Lambda is going to retrieve data using the AppConfig agent in Lambda, the Lambda extension. It's going to grab that configuration profile that I mentioned already, the flags, and it's going to grab the log level flag, and then it's going to set the log level to whatever that flag is. Okay, so I'm going to flip back here to AppConfig. I am going to go and change this to debug from info. You can see also I have a regex expression there to just make sure I typed it incorrectly. I told you typos can cause outages. And going to go ahead and save this and just push this out. Oh yeah, let me just show you here. It's set to debug. Now I'm going to start this deployment. Gunnar already sort of showed this to you. I'm going to push this out to production because I think there's something strange going on. I do want to address this quickly. So this is a deployment strategy where you can set the time of deployment. This one I'm just going to set for 2 minutes. Again, you don't want something that's going wrong to make things worse with a configuration change. So even 2 minutes is going to make a difference. It'll limit the blast radius. So I'm going to push this out. And right now it's out there deploying this change. I've heard that demos are not great if I'm pulling up debug logs. So I'm not going to show you the logs, but I think you all understand what would happen if I switch from info to debug. So again, that's a pretty common use case for using feature flags to respond to issues quickly on productions. And essentially, those are the operational flags. Dylan, I'm going to hand it over to you for A/B testing.
Thank you, Steve. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about our use case number 3, A/B testing. And A/B testing plays a large role in how Amazon makes data-driven decisions around user experience changes. So this may come as a surprise, but Amazon is actually a really, really big company. Every day we have thousands of teams innovating on behalf of millions of diverse customers all over the world. So we use experimentation to learn more about these customers and to make sure that we're making data-driven decisions around changes to user experience. So rather than hypothesizing, we can empirically prove that customers prefer one experience over another. So we do this by leveraging AppConfig and AppConfig feature flags to define new experiences and then map those new experiences to different customer segments. So in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the experiment lifecycle. So what does that actually look like at Amazon? we tend to split an experiment lifecycle up into 6 different phases. So the first is our design phase. And in that phase, we sort of need to answer a few different questions. The first is, what is our objective? So like, what is the business metric that we're ultimately trying to improve? And once we answer that, we decide on, what part of the user experience are we going to try and change? What do we think that we can change in order to achieve that objective? At Amazon, we always try and scope that change down to like the minimal set of changes, ideally 1. And that helps us isolate causation in our metrics. And then the last thing we need to define is, what is our definition of success? So what do we ultimately need to see in order to determine, like, yes, customers like this, or no, customers did not like this? So once we answer those 3 questions, we can move on to the implementation phase, which starts with creating an AppConfig feature flag. We use AppConfig feature flag attributes to tailor the behavior of a feature. And then we also use attributes to define who sees that new behavior. At Amazon, we typically prefer randomized user-based targets. So in other words, we'll try and show an experiment to a random group of 50% of users. And we prefer this for 2 different reasons. The first is we get a consistent experience for users across devices. So, we have Steve who goes and visits a website from his MacBook and then from his iPhone. He's going to get that same experience across both. And then the second reason is we get to eliminate bias through randomization. So making sure that we're selecting a random group of users. We could segment by something like location, but at the end of the day, we don't know if our customers in Florida are going to react to a UX change the same way that a customer in, let's say, the UK would. So once we've created our feature flag, we move on to go and actually implement the feature. We add code to handle our feature flag, and we have emit necessary metrics to make sure that we have information about how the experiment is doing. So in my examples here, we're going to be using CloudWatch, but in your case, you can kind of insert your APM provider of choice, and the demo is more or less going to remain the same. So once we're done our implementation, we'll gradually start to enable that feature. We always start slow, and that helps us minimize risk. So we'll start at 1 to 10% of our customers are going to see this, but once we feel confident in the change, we're ultimately going to try and increase that to an even ratio across customer segments. And the reason we choose even ratios is that ultimately that's going to maximize our test's statistical power, which is effectively going to maximize the likelihood that a test will detect a change if there is one. So once we've enabled it, we let it run for a couple of weeks, and throughout that period of time, we monitor our data. And at the end of the if we decide we want to run the experiment for 2 weeks, we analyze our data against the success criteria that we had set, and we determine if we're going to launch or not. In our case, if we launch, great. If we don't launch, also great. It means that we've learned something about our customers that we can take forward into the next experiment. So the last phase of the life cycle is cleaning up your feature flags. From a hygiene perspective, it's very, very important to make sure that you don't end up with tens, hundreds, or even thousands of different experiments, that remain in your code base. So the next, we're going to go back to our sort of not so real world example. So I'm on an engineering team at Gunnar's awesome crib rentals company. And our product team has determined that the click rate on our check availability button is lower than we'd want. And we have data that would suggest that the more clicks on check availability we get will correlate to higher rental rates. So our product team says, hey, we believe that a more eye-popping color for that button might increase the click rate, and so we're gonna go ahead and run an experiment to see if that's the case. So the first thing we need to do is define success and determine if what do we want to see to make sure that our customer, or to validate that our customers are happy with the change. So you can see here we have a demo. On the left we have our feature flag defined, and on the right we have our website. So the first thing that we're going to do is visit the website as 2 different users. We're going to visit as John Doe, and then we're going to revisit it as Jane Doe. And as you can see, the experience for both users is an orange button. So then we're going to jump over to our feature flag, and we can see that our experiment is disabled. We go down to our attributes, and like I said, this is where we define our color and our segment population. So we're going to use a color there, and then a 50% release, and we're going to enable our feature flag. We'll go ahead and save our new version, and we'll ultimately deploy it to our application. And here I'm going to use an instant deployment because it's a demo. I would not recommend doing that in production. So then we go back and we revisit the website as John, and we see an orange button. But when we revisit as Jane, we ultimately see a different color button. So we've got an awesome purple button there. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to monitor our metrics just to see, how is that new purple button performing? So throughout, as we do that again, here we have a demo of CloudWatch as our dashboarding service. But again, in your case, it might be something different. So first and foremost, you can see at the top left, we have a graph that is the most important thing on the page. What we have is actually a go, no-go alarm that's set to monitor our success criteria. So if the alarm is green, we go. If it's red, we don't. From there, we can kind of scroll down and we can get more granular with our metrics. And that's going to ultimately help me understand if we have specific users who skewed our results. And if that's the case, we might need to go back and rerun the experiment to try and make sure that we're getting a better statistical data. So like I said, ultimately, we did have a go decision based off of that top left graph. And so we get to celebrate that we have, in fact, improved our customer experience. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Ben, who's going to talk about simplifying migrations with AppConfig extensions.
All right, thank you, Dylan. Like Dylan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about use case number 4, which is simplifying AppConfig migrations through extensions. So within Amazon, we have teams that want to use AppConfig, but they already have configuration data stored in a different kind of legacy configuration store. And they don't want to spend the time and effort required to migrate all of their data from their legacy configuration store into AppConfig. And so the recommendation that we give these teams is to actually just directly deploy their legacy configuration data through AppConfig. And the way that they accomplish this is by creating an extension that transforms their data from their legacy format into the AppConfig feature flags data format. Now, extensions, in short, are AppConfig's extensibility model that allow you to plug in custom logic at various points in your configuration data's lifecycle. So this could be when your configuration is created, or when your configuration is deployed, or when it's retrieved. Extensions allow you to plug in your own custom logic at these different points in the lifecycle. And so back to this use case, what we're going to do here is leverage extensions to deploy legacy configuration data directly through AppConfig without performing a full-scale data migration. And so next, we're going to look at how this transformation extension would work. Okay, so let's assume that your legacy flag storage system is DynamoDB, which we see on the left-hand side of the screen here. We have a very simple flag. It's called Premium Features. As you can see, it's currently enabled and it has some metadata attached to it. In this case, it's the list of specific user IDs that are indeed premium users. And so you have this set up and you realize that it's a bit risky because all of your changes are instant and global, meaning each time you update your DynamoDB flag, then all consumers see the change at the same time. And whether those consumers are your backend hosts or whether they are actual end users, the point is when you make a change, everyone sees the effect of that change instantly. And in order to mitigate the risk of your configuration / flag toggles, you decide to use AppConfig because you want to take advantage of AppConfig's deployment safety features, which we've already mentioned, validators, automatic rollbacks, gradual rollouts, these things. And so again, what we're doing here is we're writing an extension, which you can see in the middle of the screen. In this case, the extension is a Lambda function. And what this extension is doing is it's converting the DynamoDB data format, which we see on the left-hand side, into the AppConfig feature flag data format, which we see on the right-hand side. And there's no real difference in what these two pieces of data or these two representations are representing. It's the same flag as you can see on the left and the right. However, this extension is just performing a transformation on the data so that it looks like the format that the AppConfig service expects. And so next, we will take a look at an architecture diagram to see how this extension fits into the bigger picture of your application. So let's bring all this together. So first, you start a deployment of your configuration data through AppConfig by calling the start deployment API, which we can see in the center of the diagram here, where the user is calling start deployment against the AppConfig service. Then the AppConfig service in turn will invoke your flag migration extension, which we spoke about on the previous slide. And again, in summary, all this extension is doing is pulling your legacy data from DynamoDB. It's transforming that data into the feature flag data format. And then it's returning that feature flag data back to the AppConfig service, which is then deploying the feature flag data. So now your deployment has started and you're taking advantage of all of the great safety features that AppConfig offers. And as this deployment progresses, your host will receive the new data via the get latest configuration API, which we can see on the right-hand side of the screen here. And this data, again, will be in the AppConfig feature flag data format instead of your legacy configuration data format. So in summary here, we were able to deploy our legacy feature toggle data through AppConfig without performing a full-scale data migration, greatly reducing the effort required to start leveraging AppConfig. Again, this is a technique that we recommend to teams within Amazon that want to start taking advantage of AppConfig as quickly and easily as possible.
Great, thank you, Ben. So those are the 4 primary use cases. We actually have 4 anti-patterns that we want to walk you through. And again, these are things we've seen inside of Amazon, unfortunately, and we just want to highlight them because things we don't want you to do with feature flags.
I will go first with the first anti-pattern. And well, this is a big one, I'd say. It's that it might happen that teams or companies or users are updating configuration data everywhere and all at once. So the demo I did before, and when we typically do demos of this, well, we want to roll things out quickly to be able to show you what the outcome actually is. But that's really not how it's supposed to be. Because when we are making these changes, we can get very unexpected behaviors and we can cause issues for the users, more or less. So unless you are really fixing something that is an issue already, then you should deploy it over time. And this, over time, it always depends, of course, what you're releasing and who the users are and so on. But we're generally talking about hours or even days to roll out something like this. So when you're rolling it out, you should then make sure to use a strategy that allows you to roll it out slowly over time to gradually perhaps increase the number of users, all while you're monitoring, making sure that the release is working as intended.
Great. Dylan, you want to take this one?
Can do. So anti-pattern number 2 sort of flows into what Gunnar was saying. So it's really nice to be able to roll configurations out slowly to minimize the blast radius of a potentially bad configuration change. But ultimately, we also want to give customers the ability to automatically roll back when something goes wrong. So we roll out to 10% and maybe we don't detect it, but we roll out to 20%. And when we do detect it, we have alarms that go and fire. We ultimately want that configuration to roll back as quickly as possible. Automation can move faster than humans can, and so it's important to, we actually, Steve mentioned, have a tool to kind of govern, how people deploy configuration. We make sure that every configuration that gets deployed through, at Amazon, has an auto rollback alarm tied to it.
Thank you. I'll take this one. This ties back to that S3 outage that I was talking about. It's super easy to have typos, especially if you're trying to use configuration to address an emergent issue. That means stress levels are high, and it's more likely that you might misconfigure something. And so, again, inside of Amazon, we have the requirement that every piece of configuration must have some sort of validation associated with it. There's two types of validation you can do. You can do what's called a syntactic validation. You can imagine that means I'm looking for correct formats. I might use JSON schema to enforce ranges. You know, if you have something that is a configuration that makes sure that you limit the number of background processes that are allowed, you might want to put that between 0 and 30 or whatever is appropriate for your application. You can enforce that kind of thing with a syntactic validation using JSON schema. There's also the ability, what we call as a semantic validation. And this is more like a functional validation. So let's say you have some configuration that is around having a database, and the configuration might be the URL of where the database is, and you're switching over to a new database. What you might want to do before you switch over to that new database with an operational flag, you might want to make sure that database is up and running and that you can write to that database. So essentially, with AppConfig, there's a validation that you can set up with a Lambda, and you might write a Lambda that says, I want to make sure this database is available and writable before I switch over to it. So that's another validator that you can add. So again, an anti-pattern would be, you know, don't just assume that there's no typos. These kind of things happen, and don't assume that whatever you're switching to is running correctly. Validate it before anything even happens. And this way, you know, again, you prevent the outage. Nothing ever gets deployed because the validator didn't pass. All right. Ben, you want to cover this one, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so the fourth and final anti-pattern here is not caching your configuration data locally. So to start with a quote from Werner Vogels, the CTO of AWS, because everything breaks all the time, you should add a buffer between your application and the configuration service. So when customers first start playing around with AppConfig, they tend to start with the simplest solution when they're just prototyping. And when I say simplest solution, I mean not caching, just calling the APIs and seeing what happens. And this is totally fine for development and prototyping, but it is not appropriate for a production system. In a production system, you should have a caching layer in between your application and the AppConfig service. And what this does is it increases the resiliency of your application, because it doesn't require your application to be able to reach the remote AppConfig service in order to read its configuration data. You know, there could be some sort of network event or outage that either restricts or completely eliminates your application's communication with AppConfig. And you want to be prepared for that type of scenario by caching your configuration data. And by the way, this isn't an AppConfig specific thing. This kind of pattern goes for nearly all remote data stores. You want to make sure you have a local copy so that you can read those things in case the remote service is unavailable. Now, there are many ways to cache. You could, for example, roll your own caching solution, which could be something somewhat straightforward, such as an in-memory cache. So you could spin up an in-memory cache that saves the configuration data that has been returned to you by AppConfig in the past, and you could fall back to that cache in the case that you are unable to talk to AppConfig. You could do this, however, it's not recommended. Instead, we recommend that you use the AppConfig agent, which we mentioned earlier, but the agent is a free client-side solution that we publish. And the agent is essentially just a sidecar process that simplifies the configuration retrieval process and incorporates best practices out of the box, including caching. There are other things that the agent does, but its primary function, or one of its primary functions rather, is caching your configuration data for you. So taking a look at these diagrams we have on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have the not recommended solution where your application is talking directly to AppConfig and not caching anything. And then on the right-hand side, of course, we have the recommended solution where you have an intermediate layer in between your application and the AppConfig service. And in this case, that intermediate layer is the AppConfig agent. Again, it's not required to use our agent. However, it is our recommended solution. So in summary, always cache your configuration data.
That is good advice, Ben. Thank you. Okay, so we just have one more slide on key takeaways, and then we can have time for questions. I guess we're going to try to end a little early, which is great. So a few lessons learned. Again, we really hope that you all learn from some of the mistakes and successes that we made at Amazon. So first lesson learned, and there's a theme of 4 things in this presentation here. So the first one of 4 is that feature flags will allow you to move fast and not break stuff. Definitely it will change your organization if you start using feature flags for the better, if you are not using them today. They are powerful. You got to be careful with them, but they really will change how you release software. There's a lot of use cases with feature flags, as you saw some today. Experimentation, operational, releasing. They're not just about releasing things safely. It's a key tool to have in the toolbox for your operations teams. As I said, they're dangerous. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people will end up making a feature flag service internally first. We hear this a lot from customers. Oh, we have our own homegrown solution, but we're starting to outgrow it. And frankly, we've had some problems with it where we've had some outages that were caused by it. And so now we're looking, for something that's probably a third party, but that has these safety features built in. And as I said, one more time, please learn from our successes. Please learn from our mistakes. These are lessons that we've learned that we don't ever want our customers to have to go through. So we've built in these things as features that are sort of safe by default inside of AppConfig. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. I haven't looked in chat, and I did get a couple DMs. So I'm going to start with a question that I got in a DM. Actually, I'm going to I'll answer this one. It was around stale feature flags. And the question is, how does Amazon deal with stale feature flags? We hear this a lot from customers. Feature flags left in your code that are short-term flags can put a lot of clutter in your code and can make debugging challenging. And so your organization needs to have some tools and some processes in place to make sure you don't have a lot of stale feature flags. What we do at Amazon is, number one, when we create a release, and we don't use Jira, but if there's an epic in Jira, a lot of our customers use Jira. When you create your epic, you should make sure that you include a story in there that says cleanup flag, and the epic is not done until the flag is cleaned up. And so that works pretty well as a mechanism that pushes back on product managers that want to move on to the next thing right away. Cleanup is part of the release. So we do that. The second thing, Gunnar showed this, that there's something inside of AppConfig that is a flag that says whether this is intended to be a short-term flag. And if we're just doing a release flag that we think we're going to clean up after the release, then we'll check that checkbox. You can also set a target deprecation date. So that's kind of a guess when we fill it out. And I think we're going to want to clean it up. I think we're going to release on this date and clean it up 2 weeks later. And so you put a date in there. AppConfig isn't going to automatically delete the flag or do anything there, but it is going to show the flag is overdue. And that helps us sort of keep us on track to see how many overdue flags do we have. And again, helps us, if we're doing sort of a hygiene sprint or something, one of the things we always look for is, do we have overdue flags that need to be cleaned up? So that's kind of our technique for managing and minimizing the number of stale flags we have in our code. Next question I saw was, can I use AppConfig for generic configuration data and not just feature flags? Ben, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure, I can take this one. Believe it or not, this is actually a pretty common question we get after these types of demos, because we spend the whole time talking about feature flags because we love feature flags. However, in reality, AppConfig does support bring your own configuration data, and we call this freeform configuration data. So if you remember actually in Gunnar's demo earlier, when he was walking through the process of creating a new feature flag, when he created his configuration profile within AppConfig, he was given a choice between a freeform configuration and a feature flag configuration. Like I said, the demos we did today were focused on the feature flag configuration type, which has a specific format. Your data must conform to a JSON schema that we publish, etc. However, if you have your own configuration data and maybe you don't want to convert it to AppConfig's feature flag format, or maybe it's just generic dynamic configuration and it's not representing a feature flag whatsoever, then we still support that through our freeform configuration type. And again, that's basically just our bring your own configuration. We don't do any sort of like automatic validation on that data or syntactic checks of that data. Of course, you can add your own validators, and we recommend that you add your own validators like Steve mentioned earlier. However, the point is you don't have to use AppConfig's opinionated feature flags format. You can bring your own configuration data, and AppConfig still supports that via the freeform configuration type.
Great, thanks. The last DM I got said, where can I use AppConfig from? Oh, okay. My company uses a mix of EKS and on-prem. Dylan, you want to cover this one, please? I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, and this is actually related to, we got a couple questions in chat as well that this might answer. So AppConfig is included in the AWS SDK, and it can be used from anywhere where you have an internet connection. That said, we also have this, I think Steve touched on it, and so did Ben, but this AWS AppConfig agent process that sort of encapsulates a number of AppConfig best practices for retrieving your configuration. That is actually vended as a Docker image that you can use in your ECS or EKS clusters. It's also vended as just for your standard Linux AMI as an RPM. And then it's also vended as a AWS Lambda extension so that you can package it up and deploy it alongside your Lambda function. So pretty much anywhere where you're running, we try and make sure that the agents can run as well. But if the agent does not run where you're running, the AWS SDK is also a perfectly valid option.
Great. Why don't we do one more question from chat? There's some specific questions in there, and what we'll do is we'll reach out to you individually. I know it just says attendee 3, or whatever the number is. Actually, because I'm host, I can see who asked that, and we'll reach out individually. But I'm scrolling through. If anybody sees a question they want to answer, jump in. But let's see. It looks like there's somebody. Dylan, you answered.
Yeah, I did want to expand on one of these questions.
We'll do 2 more. Dylan, you choose one, and Ben, you choose one.
I think I have a guess that Ben and I were going to address the same thing, so I'll let Ben do it. Ben, were you going to talk about the HTTP calls to localhost?
Yes, exactly. You read my mind.
Love it. You do it.
Okay, great. So to address this quickly, so the question in the chat is AppConfig included in the AWS SDK? I saw in the Lambda function demos that there were actual HTTP calls being done with HTTP clients. And wondering if maybe there's a module in the AWS SDK that might abstract that piece. Yes, AppConfig is absolutely available in the AWS SDK, as Dylan mentioned in the last question. The reason why you were seeing those HTTP clients being used was because those examples were using the AppConfig agent in Lambda, which is vended again as a Lambda extension. And basically the way that works is the agent, right, it's a sidecar process. It spins up its own local HTTP server. And then your application essentially just makes localhost HTTP calls to talk to the agent. And so you have a couple options for talking to the agent in this way. Option number 1, like you saw in the demos, are to use standard HTTP library that's provided in your Lambda functions language, which is what you saw in the demos earlier. However, you can also use the AWS SDK to make these calls as well. And essentially what the SDK does is it provides you an option to override the endpoint that the SDK uses to talk to AppConfig. So essentially you can just use your regular AppConfig SDK, and in your client builder, when you build your AppConfig client, you can override the endpoint to your localhost, the localhost port that the agent is running on, and you can just interact with the agent through the SDK that you're probably used to using when you interact with AppConfig without the agent. So that's why you saw those just those raw HTTP calls being made and not the actual SDK being used. But the AppConfig is absolutely available in the AWS SDK.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to call it. I want to say thank you very much to our attendees. Like I said, we'll get to all the questions that were posted there and do some individual outreach. Thank you, and I hope this was instructive, and have a good rest of your day or evening or tomorrow. All right, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.